All right, let's jump right on into chapter 25, where we are going to discuss the Cold War. So, a few things I want to make sure that we understand, like from the introductions, that the relations between the United States and the Soviet Union, they had been allies, but as soon as World War II was over, that relationship disintegrated, right? So George Kennan's long telegram, which denounced the Soviet Union and called for containment. So containment is where we want to really stop the spread of communism. The USSR, Russia, actually was a communist country, very socialist. So we started seeing the polarization between the West, the Western capitalism, democracy versus the communist, idea. Did I say capitalist and communist? There we go. The Cold War was a global political and ideological struggle between, basically, like I said, capitalism and communism. Also, the communist countries were also marked as being, or touted as being, atheist. Okay, so which wasn't completely true, but that was sort of the point. Going back to Albert Pike's letter to Mancini, that was exactly what was supposed to to happen for after World War II. That was one of the goals, was to set up Russia as kind of the bastion of communism and atheism. Okay, so the two were kind of the surviving superpowers, and in the post World War II world, if you will. So the first Cold War lasted from about the mid 1940s on into the 60s, and then there was kind of a break, and then it picked up or heated or cooled off again, if you will, around 1979, and kind of went into the Berlin Wall was destroyed in 1989. Okay, but overall, the Cold War had a transformative influence on the world and the generations that was living, kind of in its shadow. So some of the political, economic, and military dimensions: the Cold War emerged from the failure to establish a lasting settlement among the United States, Britain, and the Soviet Union after World War II. Deliberations began over reparations, tribunals, and the nature of an occupation regime for Germany that would initially be divided into American, British, French, and Soviet zones. The Allies, kind of had start being real suspicious and mistrustful of Russia, in particular. So this was exacerbated by the sudden death of Franklin Roosevelt and Truman's hardline anti-Soviet stance. So, Roosevelt was more so the give them a chance. Let's see, keeping that olive branch extended. At least that was the optics of it. So, he was not necessarily kind of off with their head. We don't have nothing to do with Russia. They're horrible, so forth and so on, which is where Truman, who came in after FDR, after Roosevelt passed, Truman had a very anti-Soviet stance. So although Roosevelt was skeptical of Stalin, he was always trying to hold out hope. Okay, so Truman and Churchill, both in Europe, both of them were like, we ain't playing no games with Russia. Okay, so then you had the Potsdam Conference. Now, at the Potsdam Conference, which was held on the outskirts of Berlin from mid-July into early August, the Allies debated the fate of the Soviet-occupied Poland. All right. On July 24th, when Truman told Stalin about his new weapon and with unusual destructive force, he was like talking about, oh yeah, we've got this great a new weapon. You ain't seen nothing like this before. And and so Stalin was like, yeah, okay, make good use of it then. He was nonplussed. He was not like afraid or shaken by some new scary weapon. So they didn't get the results they were looking for. That was kind of I'm trying to bully you or punk you kind of move. Stalin wasn't having it. So the roots of the Cold War can actually be traced back to the Bolshevik revolution. So the United States had interfered intervened militarily against the Red Army during the Russian Civil War. So we over here dealing with somebody else's business. So here we are, Russia's supposed to be one of our allies, but we over here, when they're having an issue, we go against their regime and support their opposition. So when the Soviet Union was founded in 1922, the United States refused to recognize it, right? So the World War II was an alliance of convenience. Now keep in mind, the USSR, Russia, and America were never actually friends. But as they say, the enemy of my enemy is my friend. So they both had, kind of that common, enemy involved, which was Germany. So they joined forces, right? So let's move on to the IMF and the World Bank. So the International Monetary Fund. So we're going to talk about that. So in 1941, Roosevelt and Churchill issued a joint declaration of goals for post-war peace, right? It was known as the Atlantic Charter. It established the creation of the United Nations, right, and gave the USSR a seat at the Security Council or Committee, right along with the USA, the UK, France, and China. Well, in 1944, the UN Financial and Monetary Conference came along, right? More popularly known as the Bretton Woods Conference. The Bretton Woods Conference. It created an international monetary fund, right? And it became the forerunner of the World Bank. The International Bank for Reconstruction and Development, kind of like IBRD. So that's what was their acronym. They love acronyms. But what's more important really to understand about the International Monetary Fund is pushing closer to this monetary global one world order. Now, this is not some weird conspiracy theory that you may hear or believe or have been led to believe in the past. No, you go back and you look at every one of the presidents in the 20th century, and they are all preparing and talking about bringing in the new world order. You hear Bush Sr. talking about it, Bush Jr., Ronald Reagan. The list just goes on and on with all of the different presidents, and not just Republicans, all talking about this new world order. We're establishing this new world order. Well, in order to have a new world order, you need an international monetary system. And that's actually where this began in 1944. With the Bretton Woods system, was bolstered in 1947 with the addition of the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade. So you also had that come as part of that, which was a forerunner, sort of like the first time they tried it, and it kind of turned into the World Trade Organization. The Soviets rejected all of it. They wanted no parts of it. So now the Long Telegram in 1946, the Soviets refused to leave occupied Iran. The Americans discovered a spy in the Manhattan Project. The U.S. refused Soviet calls to dismantle their nuclear program. And in 1942, the Articles for Foreign Affairs, written under the pseudonym Mr. X, George Kennan warned that the Americans should, quote, continue to regard the Soviet Union as a rival, not a partner. Now, again, this is all under what's called the Long Telegram. So these are some major points. He also wrote that Stalin harbored, quote, no real faith in the possibility of a permanent, happy coexistence of the socialist and capitalist worlds. He urged U.S. leaders to pursue a policy of firm containment designed to confront the Russians. So again, the Long Telegram is mostly known for Mr. Kennan's points about containment, pushing the idea of containment. So just again to recap, containment is keeping the Soviets from spreading communism into other areas, right? You also had the Truman Doctrine. So in March of 1947, the United States would provide political, military, and economic assistance to all democratic nations under threat from external or internal authoritarian forces, particularly communism. $400 million in aid was given to Greece and Turkey, where terrorist activities led by communists Same playbook all the time. We never do anything different. It's always the same, MO in order to achieve this goal. And they're going to keep using it because people won't wake up and it continues to work. So you have this idea, you say, oh, there's this boogeyman, these communists, they're terrorists, and this gives you then credence to do, to execute your plan. So Britain was reducing and abandoning commitments all over the world. The United States worried that if it didn't step in, Stalin would gain influence, and they didn't want that. So the term Cold War was popularized by Walter Lippmann, who envisioned a prolonged ideological struggle between the United States and the USSR. It was called Cold because they didn't really have an actual fight between the two. Now, there were proxy wars, and we'll talk a little bit about that later, but the two of them never fought. The USA and the USSR never actually fought. He also cautioned against making far-flung, open-ended commitments, favoring instead a more limited engagement that focused on halting the influence of communism in the heart of Europe. He believed that if the Soviet system were successfully restrained on the continent, it would otherwise be left alone to collapse under the weight of its own imperfection. So this is what Walter Lippmann had to say about containment as well. Okay. You also had the Marshall Plan. American officials worried that Europe's impoverished masses were increasingly vulnerable to Soviet propaganda. So again, if you've got all these people who are very poor and not doing well at all, worried about how they're going to even feed their hungry children, socialism becomes a little bit more appealing. Okay, so we were worried that, oh my gosh, if we don't do something about the devastation and the poverty that was left in the wake of World War II, Europe, our friends, our allies, are actually going to fall prey. The people are going to, be susceptible to a more socialist, platform for economic and government. Okay, so the European Recovery Program, the ERP, popularly known as the Marshall Plan, pumped $13 billion towards reconstruction while simultaneously loosening trade barriers between 1948 and 1952. Funny how much money we have for everybody else, but we have no money for our own people. Figure that one out. Stalin saw these attempts to lure Europe into America's capitalist web, and you're not completely wrong on that. The Soviets countered with their rival Molotov Plan, which was a symbolic pledge of aid to Eastern Europe. So as we start to see, there becomes this more pronounced divide between the East and the West. All right. The Polish leader Józef Cyrankiewicz, this is an interesting name. I'm going to spell this one. Cyrankiewicz. Unfortunately, I don't speak Polish, unfortunately, so I know I'll mess that name up. I apologize. But he was rewarded with a 5-year, $450 million trade agreement from Russia for boycotting the Marshall Plan. So when Czechoslovakia received $200 million in American assistance, Stalin summoned Czech Foreign Minister Jan Masaryk to Moscow. So all of this is really heating up for the Cold War, like, really throwing logs on the fire of the Cold War. So you're really seeing more splitting. So that divide is getting wider and wider between the West and the East, between capitalism and communism. So Berlin and Germany itself had been divided into communist and capitalist zones. So in June of 1948, when the US, British, and French officials introduced a new currency, the Soviet Union initiated a ground blockade. Stalin cut off the railroad access to West Berlin. So it was landlocked within the Soviet-occupied zone. So in order to gain control over the entire city, well, the United States organized and coordinated a massive airlift campaign that flew essential supplies into the beleaguered city for 11 months. So the things that were needed for West Berlin, we were flying it in and airlifting the supplies. And on May 23rd, the western half of the country was formally renamed the Federal Republic of Germany, or FRG, and the Eastern Soviet Zone became the German Democratic Republic, or the GDR. Later, that fell. Germany would remain a divided country, though, until 1989, when the Berlin Wall is finally taken down. Okay, and speaking of the Berlin Wall was a guarded concrete barrier that physically and ideologically divided Berlin from 1961 until 1989. It was constructed by the German Democratic Republic, the GDR, East Germany, the communists, this is who was doing that, to prevent East Berliners from defecting or leaving the country to go over to West Berlin. So for people who were in the communist area, they didn't want you getting out. They didn't want you to escape and leave and go over to the capitalist side. So that was part of the reason why it was built. At its peak, the wall was 155 kilometers or 96 miles long and was heavily fortified with guard towers, bunkers, and anti-vehicle trenches. Between 1949 and 1961, before the wall was built, around 20% of the East Germany population fled to the West. So they got out about 20% of the people. So it really kind of it speaks volumes because, for as much as we may think, we want, people may have wanted some socialism, but it really was not going to work. And people didn't really want that. They really want the opportunity to work and build themselves and, based on their own merit and ingenuity, etc., to really make them something of themselves. And that you don't have that option under a socialist situation. So the fall of the Berlin Wall in 1989 was a pivotal event that precipitated the reunification of Germany and the end of the Cold War. That was a big, big thing. Of course, I was in high school at the time, and it was just huge. What just ideologically, we have won. That was kind of a mark that the West, America, had won the Cold War. Okay, NATO and the Warsaw Pact. In the summer of 1949, American officials launched the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, what we call NATO, a mutual defense pact. The United States and Canada were joined by England, France, Belgium, Luxembourg, the Netherlands, Italy, Portugal, Norway, Denmark, and Iceland. The goal was that an attack on any of them was an attack on all of them. So basically, it just formed an international gang. Everybody was jumped in. And if somebody had a problem, if you had a problem with one, by default, you were going to have to fight all of them. The Soviet Union would formulate its own defensive agreement in 1955, and it was called the Warsaw Pact. It included Albania, Romania, Bulgaria, Hungary, Czechoslovakia, Poland, and East Germany. Okay, so again, that wedge is being dug in even deeper, and it's becoming wider between East and West. All right, you had Chinese communism. So in 1949, the Chinese Communist Party, or the CCP, was led by Mao Zedong, and he declared victory over the Kuomintang nationalists, which was led by Chiang Kai-shek, causing panic among American policymakers. The Kuomintang retreated to the island of Taiwan, and the CCP took over the mainland under the red flag of the People's Republic of China, which is what we know it, we kind of know it as now. The USSR had successfully tested their first nuclear weapon in 1949, so loss of China was even more damaging. So when we lost China being able to be an ally with us, and when they went over to the, to the communist side, that was a huge deal, because we no longer had, had that strong ally anymore. They were now communists. The failure of Truman to provide military to help against Mao led Stalin to believe that Korea could be taken without American intervention. So that's one of the reasons starting up to get into the Korean conflict, and it would actually be the catalyst to lead us into the Vietnam War as well. So as we get to those wars, and these are by default they kind of proxy wars overall, because they're fighting between the two ideologies of the superpowers, the USSR and the USA, but not fighting between them directly. So I gave the analogy of Hungry Hippo. So that in that game, you've got the two hippos trying to get all the marbles on the board. And, that's what this is about. So at this point, you've lost China, but you've got all these other Asian countries in there. And America is very concerned that other Asian countries are going to fall to the communist side. So Vietnam, Korea, Thailand, Cambodia, and Laos, all of these countries, you're going to start seeing some fighting going on in there. I'm not going to go into as much, maybe like the NSC, the National Security Council, but in short, so read through that. But in short, it really expanded our military budget. So that was one of the things that it was done. It urged a rapid buildup of political, economic, and military strength in order to roll back the Kremlin's drive for world domination. I mean, they really make them sound like they are, no. I mean, just like the villains, right? Let me see, like I just mentioned, the Korean War, that's definitely coming into that between 1950 and 1953. Again, a proxy war. After Japan surrendered in September of 1945, the U.S.-Soviet joint occupation had paved the way for the division of Korea. The UN passed a resolution that the united government in Korea should be created, but the Soviet Union refused to cooperate. They're saying, we're not leaving. We got this spot. We're staying here. So in June of 1950, fighting broke out in Korea between the communist forces in the north and American-backed anti-communist in the south. So North Korea is going to be communist, and South Korea is going to be capitalist, or anti-communist, if you will. In the spring of 1950, Stalin hesitantly endorsed North Korea leader Kim Sung, his plan to liberate the South by force. So basically he said, we just gonna go ahead and take it, right? Emboldened by Mao's victory in China. So when Mao Zedong actually came into power in China, who's communist, that emboldened or strengthened the resolve of the North Korea, the feeling if they could take South Korea. Well, the United Nations supported the South and asked member states to send military to defend South Korea against the North, okay, under General Douglas MacArthur. General Douglas MacArthur, okay? After pushing the North Koreans out of the South and almost defeating them, the Chinese entered the battle. So just as we were just about to declare victory, China jumps in. Retreating back south, General MacArthur pressed Truman to use nuclear weapons on North Korea and China, but Truman removed him from his position instead. Like, oh, you trying to get everybody blown up. You tripping. I don't know what you thought, because if we push this button, you already know that Russia had already started testing, and they had nuclear capabilities as well at this time. So it's not like the U.S. was the only boys on the block with the big gun. Okay, so you're talking about most of the world being annihilated. Boy, sit down somewhere. So he sent MacArthur on out of there. Now, what's called, excuse me, the Forgotten War, the war ended in a stalemate and an armistice, which just means the end of fighting. That agreement was signed in 1953. Stalin died in 53, and General Eisenhower became the president. 30,000 American soldiers died, and it was the first war with integrated troops. And this is significant because up until this point in both World War I and World War II, although blacks were, blacks and Hispanics and Chinese were participating and supporting the military, they were not integrated. So you had black troops or colored troops or, like that. And then you had your standard white troops. Okay. Truman was able to successfully use the United Nations to repel communism, and it worked. The communists were held back. It also set a precedence for getting involved in other countries, such as Vietnam. Okay, is when we said, in the decades to come. So it's not going to be long. We're going to end up in Vietnam as well. So in the 50s, when we're dealing with Korea, we're looking at that domino effect. We don't want the other Asian countries to go towards communism. So this kicks off with Vietnam's independence wars between 1945 and 1975. Vietnam, known then as French Indonesia, Indochina. I said Indonesia. Indochina, French Indochina, had been colonized by France and seized by Japan during World War II. So the nationalist leader, Ho Chi Minh, had been backed by the United States during his anti-Japanese insurgency. Ho Chi Minh had also written letters to Woodrow Wilson after World War I asking for support in their independence movement, but Wilson didn't respond. Okay? So following Japan's surrender in 1945, Viet Minh nationalists, quoting the American Declaration of Independence, created the Independent Democratic Republic of Vietnam. That's the DRV. But France tried to reassert colonial control over Vietnam. And the United States and the UK supported them. Supported the French, their ally, instead of supporting the Vietnamese self-determination. So as always, I hate to say it, but we talk out of both sides of our mouths. On the one hand, we're saying we want the world free for democracy. We want everybody in the world should be like us and be, have democratic, countries. But our friends can go in and colonize, areas and exploit the people and their land and their resources and their labor, and that's okay. But if those very people want to stand up, exert their own independence under a democratic system, we don't support them. So that's exactly one of the main reasons why we're going to end up in a war in Vietnam. So the American intervention in Vietnam, with no support from the USA or Britain against their ally France, the Vietnamese turned to the only other powers willing to supply them, and that is who? The Soviet Union and China. So now here we go. The very thing you're trying to say you are, trying to prevent, which is the spread of communism. But it's okay. But again, it's okay as long as our European allies are able to exploit the people. If they raise up, we're not going to support them. We're not going to give those people any support. So, of course, the people are going to go to where they can get support. And they're able to get support from China and Russia. So after the French troops were defeated, and the French always get defeated, y'all. I'm sorry. I don't know what about the French, but they always get defeated. They got defeated at the Battle of Dien Bien Phu. That's Dien Bien Phu in May of 1954. The U.S. officials helped broker a temporary settlement. So Vietnam would be partitioned or divided into two parts at the 17th parallel. So you've got North Vietnam with the Soviet Chinese backing, and South Vietnam with the American backed, states in the South. The United States would send arms, offer other military advisors, prop up corrupt politicians, do everything, stop elections, and eventually would send 500,000 troops to unsuccessfully keep the South from falling to communism by 1975. So this is all, we were trying it all, pulling out all the stops, corruption, all the things that we've tried, we've talked about before, even under imperialism. Look what we tried to infiltrate, areas like in Mexico, etc., prop up our own people, drive out the rulers and leaders, and then set up our own. None of that worked here. None of it. So take a look at the arms buildup, the space race, and some of our technological advancements. So the nature of warfare was actually changed after the United States dropped the bomb on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. So now you've got this very, very powerful weapon that's in play, and both sides have it. Both sides have access to it, have the technology. So that really does change even how wars are fought. The Soviets successfully tested an atomic bomb in August of 1949, triggering a nuclear arms race with the United States. So the arms race is basically everybody, the United States and Russia are both in all the places that they have allies setting up nuclear bases so that they can quickly just decimate the allies, or their enemies. So so you're going to see that, like America being friends, if you will. Like I said, we supported Greece and Turkey, so we had a missile launch right there in Turkey. That's in the backyard of the Russians, of Russia. So that's going to come into play and become more important when we get to the Cuban Missile Crisis a little bit later. All right. Let's see. Take a look at, because again, I don't want this to be forever. So go ahead and take a look at the H-bomb and MAD, M-A-D, which is mutually assured destruction. Okay. And atomic anxiety and nuclear power. So plots featuring radioactive monsters, nuclear accidents, and doomsday scenarios. These are things that people are really afraid of. Films like Godzilla, On the Beach, Failsafe, and Dr. Strangelove, or How I Learned to Stop Worrying and Love the Bomb, is kind of how it was measured. And the depths, it kind of measured the depths of American anxieties. People were terrified. So if you are a big fan of like sci-fi, like me, I used to love, I still do, like Twilight Zone and some of these things. If you go back and you look even back in the 50s, a lot of the shows that they were putting out, those episodes really did feature potential situations for nuclear fallout. Even into the 90s and early 2000s, we still would see movies that was a theme. Blast from the Past, a kind of a romantic comedy with, I think, Alicia Silverstone and Brendan Fraser. This show that he'd grown up in this fallout shelter, his whole life with his dad, played by Christopher Walken, and his mom, Sissy Spacek. Check out the movie if you get a chance, Blast from the Past. But anyway, this has been a theme because it was really at the forefront of a lot of people's minds, right? We had, rockets in the space race. Soviets and Americans both hope to create ICBMs, which are intercontinental ballistic missiles that could carry nuclear bombs to other countries without needing planes. So both sides were trying to do that. Also, Operation Paperclip. I think I mentioned that a lot of stuff that people talk about, they would say, oh, this was, that was a conspiracy, that was a conspiracy theory. It's not. Now that a lot of the papers and a lot of the information has become declassified, that information is coming out. So for instance, Operation Paperclip, which actually talks about there was a secret operation that brought Nazi scientists, Nazis, mind you, these are supposed to be the horrible, most worst people on the planet, supposedly. But we were bringing them over and, having them work for the United States during the Cold War on Cold War technologies. A lot of the things that were done during these experiments that they were doing on people, etc., in Germany, that technology and that information, they had them come over here. And that included so many, including Einstein. Okay, so the Soviets were the first to develop the ICBM, okay, and use the tech to send the first satellite into space. So Sputnik 1 was a Soviet satellite launched into space on October 4th of 1957. So Sputnik, that was a big thing. So now we know all the digital angels and all the different satellites that we have everywhere. Just know Russia was the first to get those up. All right. So take a look at NASA and the space race. I'm not going to go into, all of the astronauts and all that kind of stuff like that. Take a look at that. Also, fallout shelters, as we mentioned before, that became a huge thing. Anybody who could afford to, they had underground bunkers, to varying levels and degrees of sophistication for length of time, for half-life and all these different things, because they were really, it was a real and present threat that somebody could push a button and the whole world would pretty much be gone, all right? The Cold War, Red Scare, McCarthyism, and liberal anti-communism. So during the early 1950s, Joseph McCarthy, a Republican senator from Wisconsin, he fueled the fears. I mean, they fanned the fears so much. That's one of the ways they get people to do what they want them to do under the Hegelian dialectic, is you push fear. You push fear, right? So he fueled the fears of communism in the United States, leading to a period known as McCarthyism. McCarthy claimed to have a list. Now, mind you, this man has stood up here and said, I have a list of 250 Communist Party sympathizers and members right here in, that who work in the government. And although the number changed a lot, he changed those numbers like, okay, I'm going to say that. I'm going to stay nice. But anyway, he changed the numbers a lot, causing ridicule, but also gaining him a lot of fame. McCarthyism was part of a larger anti-communist hysteria that gripped the country during the Cold War. So including loyalty reviews for federal employees, investigations into communist influence, and the establishment of anti-subversive communities. Politicians use fear-mongering, again, just trying to make everybody scared, creating public fear to gain fame and to win elections. Make sure you're very familiar with that term of fear-mongering, okay? The HUAC and loyalty reviews. So facing growing anti-communism excitement and with the tough election on the horizon, Truman gave in to pressure in March of 1947 and issued his loyalty order. The Executive Order 9835 established loyalty reviews for federal employees. So you could not work for the federal government, unless you underwent a loyalty review. So the FBI conducted closer examinations of all political security risk among foreign service officers. In Congress, the House Un-American Activities, that's HUAC, H-U-A-C, the House Un-American Activities. Now again, anything that is not cookie cutter and the conforming was considered abnormal and anti-American. So this is really going to be used as a way to further oppress already disenfranchised groups, right? You are going to, if you believe in helping people, you give too much charity in church, that's socialism, that's communist leaning. So, or if you criticize in any way the government, yet you're a communist. If you don't accept the boot on your neck and take it happily with a smile, you're a communist. So anybody who had any critique of, policies, laws, or anything during this time were labeled subversives and were punished severely. Now, this is even worse, I will say, for white Americans, because keep in mind, Black Americans were not allowed into these jobs and positions anyway. So you're talking about middle-class white Americans who were being terrorized by McCarthy, and anything that you do, if you don't go to church on Sunday, if you are not heterosexual, if you are not married by 25, all of these things were considered un-American, and you were looked at as some type of a subversive. You listen to speakeasy music or whatever, just all kind of crazy stuff. So anyway, between 1949 and 1954, congressional committees conducted over 100 investigations into subversive activities. At the University of California, Berkeley, for example, 31 professors were dismissed in 1950s for refusing to sign a loyalty oath. Now, if they institute this again, y'all know they're going to fire me first. Okay, I'm going to be the first one to be gone if the college ever decides to, reinstitute the loyalty, because again, I'm going to tell the truth about what it is. So, but that was considered subversive at the time. To some degree, it still is. All right, so registering communists. So the Internal Security Act, or the McCarran Act, not to be confused with McCarthyism, but it was passed by Congress in September of 1950, and it mandated that all communist organizations had to register with the government. So if, long before, even before McCarthyism, there were communist parties, in operation right here, going back as early, as the turn of the 20th century. This gave the government greater powers to investigate sedition and made it possible to prevent suspected individuals from gaining or keeping their citizenship. So then sedition is when you are encouraging or inciting people to rebel. So that's what sedition is. So mind you, at a time in 1950 where we'd had such large influxes of immigrants coming in. Now, they may have been, came over with their parents in the, the early part of the 20th century, and, 1910, 1920, came over as little children, raised their entire lives in America. Again, they were immigrants, and they could be deported if they were suspected, not even proven really, but suspected of sedition. All right. So then you got into spy mania. So a lot of our, James Bond, spy movies, etc., all that really fueled the imagination. So a lot of movies and books and shows really pushed that narrative. Julius and Ethel Rosenberg, both members of the Communist Party of the United States, right, in the 1930s. Now, mind you, this was 20 years before McCarthyism, were accused of passing atomic secrets to the Soviets while working for the U.S. Army during World War II. After a trial in March 1951, they were both found guilty and executed in 1953. Him and his wife. Alger Hiss, a State Department official, was found to be part of a communist spy ring when a young Richard Nixon accused him. Whittaker Chambers testified before the HUAC that he and Hiss had worked together as part of the secret communist underground in Washington, D.C. Hiss served 3.5 years in prison despite always claiming innocence. Later evidence suggested he was guilty. So he was apparently part of a communist party. But remember what I was telling you about Father Charles Laughlin and so many others, had radio broadcast and things like that had a very, what we would call today anti-Semitic, but in actuality they were really pushing the idea that, hey, the elite, the Jewish elite, and these Masons are running the country. They have a cabal, a group, and they are the main players controlling everything. So they were trying to blow the whistle on that. Well, during McCarthyism, many people who were supporters of these folks going back into the 30s, on, were rounded up as, kind of communist or communist leaning, etc. So many of them, got swept up into that as well for going against, what we are really starting to understand again now. They knew this back in the 20s, 30s, and 40s, that there was a strong Jewish elite and Masonic stronghold choking the country out. Okay? So take a look at taking down McCarthy, because like I said, I want to get through the rest of this real quick. Taking down McCarthy and what American communism actually looked like, right? And how communism was actually criminalized with things like the Taft-Hartley Act of 1947, the Communist Control Act of 1954, and the role of the domestic Cold War on was how it was bipartisan. Both the Democrats and the Republicans, were together and united in their anti-communist approach, right? So FBI and Hollywood, there we go once again. So J. Edgar Hoover played an active role in the fight against communism and contributed to the culture of fear as well. So on the one hand, you had McCarthy, but you also, on the other hand, always two wings on the same bird, you had J. Edgar Hoover pushing this narrative, this fear mongering. So he used Hollywood, because that's how they push a lot of their information and signal their next moves. So, and to keep people, terrified. So the Red Menace was 1949. My Son John came out in 1951, and I Led Three Lives, 1953 through 1956, depicted espionage and treason in a free world imperiled by communism. So take a look at that. People were getting blacklisted. Look and see what that means. The film mogul Walt Disney and actor Ronald Reagan, among others, testified to aid investigators' attempts to expose to expose communist influence in Hollywood. So you had, like I said, them really pushing, trying to say, oh, there's so many people in Hollywood who are, communists. They're very liberal, very left-leaning, or they may be, hey, let's give reparations to the black people for building the country and for everything we did to them, just like we gave reparations to everybody else. Let's do that. Well, nope. You're a communist. You're going to be, wiped out, blacklisted. Okay, so, or let's give better schools in impoverished communities, in rural areas, whatever it may have been. All of those things were considered to be very communist. If there's any help being given, that's communism. Okay, conformity and deviancy. Again, there was this push that everybody needed to be cookie cutter. The same look, the same ideas, and anything that's off of that is deviant. So conformity, again, you're going to behave according to social standards of the majority. You're basically going to have to fall in line, and if not, you are a deviant. So any behaviors that become dangerous, which is considered non-conforming, abnormal, or atypical. Okay. Things as absolutely ridiculous as, for and I keep coming back to this, but even for Black Americans, as a woman, if you wanted to, have a job, even work, because we were domestics a lot of time, but if you weren't willing to wear your hair straight, if you were going to wear your hair natural, in its natural state, or God forbid, have it braided, that was not conforming, because that's not the look. That's atypical. So those type of things were considered deviant. You know, and way more if you were, again, part of what we would talk the burgeoning LGBTQ community. If you just anything you did that was not, you know, to the line was considered deviant. Okay, those who did not conform to the values were targeted. So middle-class women were told to go back to housekeeping. Black soldiers were told to return back home and acquiesce. The American racial order, like, you know, fall in line, boy, get back to the bottom. I don't care if you were a war hero or whatever the case may be. You also had what was called the Lavender Scare. So again, the Lavender Scare is a fear of all things homosexual. So the LGBTQ, again, this was considered sexual perversion. At the time, being gay was considered a mental illness. Okay, so the Lavender Scare was really, you know, people were very, very concerned that homosexuals were going to take over. So God and patriotism, again, because we're fighting atheism and communism. So what do? We go even further. We go harder in the paint for God and to be in, you know, waving that flag. So religion became a focal point. Americans during the early Cold War attended church, professed a belief in a supreme being, and stressed the importance of religion in their lives at higher rates than in any other time in American history. Okay, so all of these things are really being pushed in popular culture. One of the most popular films of the decades was Charlton Heston playing Moses in the Ten Commandments, right? Notice there were certain things he couldn't do, you know, in that particular movie. But that came out in 1956, covering the Exodus story. So we start seeing more and more of that. Take a look at religion and McCarthyism. The link between American nationalism and religion became closer and closer. McCarthy's power grew until he was eventually censored and faded into irrelevance eventually. So censure basically is a formal expression of severe disapproval. So at some point people say, man, you doing too much. You need to sit your old skip your head, swoop head self down somewhere. Ain't nobody listening to you no more. So because he was just going way too far. Like I said, literally telling particularly, you know, like black women, you can't wear braids, or you can't do this, or you can't do that. I mean, it was just ridiculous what they were getting, you know, what they were getting into. So continue to take a look at that. The legacy that McCarthy left, it suppressed movements for social justice such as civil rights, gay rights, and feminism. Because everybody was supposed to conform. So there, you know, you're definitely going to be stifled. And if you dare stand up and say, hey, this mistreatment is wrong, you were, you know, blacklisted, you were blackballed, you were, you know, lost your jobs, you were run out of town, you know, tarred and feathered, all kinds of things. So look, the decolonialization and the global reach of the American century. So in an influential 1941 Life magazine editorial titled The American Century, publishing magnate Henry Luce outlined his vision of America as the principal guarantor of freedom of the seas and the dynamic leader of world trade. So we're, again, bolstering this idea of America being the pinnacle that everybody should follow, and this is what the example that's being set. So take a look at that. And as France and Britain in particular struggled in vain to control colonies in Asia, the Middle East, and North Africa, the United States assumed responsibility for maintaining order and producing a kind of Pax Americana. Now, Pax is the Latin word for peace. And you know, anytime they start saying peace, sudden death and destruction follows. In order to keep these former colonies and developing nations, America believed they needed to step in and help them. And what that help oftentimes meant is we just become your masters, as opposed to Britain, France, etc. So We talked a little bit about the domino theory, the belief that if one, all the Asian countries, once China became a communist country, a lot of these other smaller countries would then fall to communism. We saw how Korea was divided. Then Vietnam was divided between North and South factions, with one half supporting communism, the other side being backed by the U.S. with capitalism. So they were worried that if America allowed Vietnam to fall, then Cambodia, Laos, and Thailand would be next. Cuba was seen as a communist beachhead that imperiled or risked Latin America, the Caribbean, and perhaps even the United States. So Cuba, and that's going to come into real play with Fidel Castro soon. Take a look at the permanent war economy. So in short, our military spending has just grown and grown and grown and grown and grown over the past, 70, 80 years. It's like out of control, just how much we spend on military. So that, and our economy, so much of it being based on military, the production and, of materials for war. So guns, ammunitions, et cetera, right? So that's what a lot of our economy was based on. So that is called a military-industrial complex. Anytime you're talking about an industrial complex, what you're talking about is a government-backed private sector that is profiting tremendously on a particular area. So when we talk about military, we have, Boeing, you have, I can't think of some of the other warmonger names, but, they make so much money by supplying goods, technology, guns, weapons, tanks, etc. to the government. So the military industrial complex. So Mills and others questioned the effects of massive defense spending, which he said corrupted the ruling class or the power elite, which we know who that is, who now had the potential to take the country into war for the sake of corporate profit. Because you can't keep justifying spending trillions of dollars on the war machine, preparation for war, if there is no war. So you see, we have to constantly have a boogeyman. We have to constantly have someone that, that we're fighting in order to justify all of this money. Now, mind you, not only is the money going for military, again, it's going to very select groups of people, companies, it's not even coming back into, like, say, American workers and dollars. This is, again, the elite using the government as its personal piggy bank. Okay. Look at the effects of decolonization. I know we talked a little bit about that already with, we said Vietnam and some other areas. So definitely look at that. Cuba is going to come into place with that as well. Third world competition. American post-war foreign policy struggled to balance support for decolonization against the reality that national independence movement often posed a threat to America's global interests. Foreign policy officials increasingly opposed all insurgencies or independent movements that could in any way be linked to international communism. Stalin and his successors created client states in Europe and Central Europe. Eastern and Central Europe, if I didn't say that. Soviet leaders tended to support left-wing liberation movements everywhere, particularly when they espoused or, adopted anti-American sentiments. So we saw that, we talked about it a bit in one of the chapters coming up again. Like I said, the Cuban Missile Crisis, how that comes in, our kind of bullying of Cuba. When Fidel Castro comes into power and he starts kicking folks out, America's trying to fight with them, who do they go to? They become friends with Russia. Let's see here. Take a look at a couple of things. The Smith-Mundt Act of 1948, which was a propaganda campaign to promote a better understanding of the United States in other countries. So again, trying to make it seem like we're there under some peacekeeping kind of thing, where we're really helping folks, and all of this. So this is the mindset. This is what we are being told or being programmed. Take a look at the information on dictatorships over democracy. So you've got Fulgencio Batista, you in Cuba, and you're just going to go through South Korea, Philippines, Zaire, Chile, just all of these different groups. Take a look at that. Be at least familiar with who they are and where they're from. Okay, we've talked a lot about civil rights. So some of the Kremlin propaganda pointed to injustices of the American South as an example of American hypocrisy. So everybody in the world know what y'all doing, and black folk over there ain't right. And how dare you think you have the moral high ground to come and tell us anything, and you can't even get your own house in order. Sit down, America. That's basically what other countries, particularly the communists, are saying, and they're using that, and they weren't wrong. I mean, you can't argue with that logic. So that was some of the propaganda and information that they were using. So finally, in conclusion, as we're at the top of the hour, Ronald Reagan's demands to tear down the Berlin Wall in 1987 was followed by the opening of East Berlin in 1989 and the reunification of Germany in 1990. So that was kind of cool. The Berlin Wall came down in 89. The collapse of the Warsaw Pact and the dissolution of the Soviet Union in 1991 also freed several countries from Russian domination. Remember, we talked about Czechoslovakia, Poland, etc., all of those countries. The causes of the Cold War's end have been debated. They have, attributing it to either conservative pressure or internal reforms in Russia. However, they emphasize that regardless of the cause, the Cold War had a profound impact on American history, including millions of deaths in related conflicts, changes in American politics and culture, and a transformation of America's global role. So all of this is going on. The Cold War, spanning from the 40s to the 60s, and then again, from the latter part of the 70s into the late 80s. Two waves of the Cold War really did change the landscape. It changed how war was done. We saw a lot of proxy wars. We saw how fear was being used as a tactic, as always, but we really saw it come into prominence at that time. So take a look, make sure you guys really understand McCarthyism and many of the acts that that were done, whether they were political acts that came out, or how Hollywood and some of these things were used to further that. So that is chapter 25, and I'll be back a little bit later with chapter 26. All right.